Hello. Last class we explored Act 1 of Phaedra, and today I want to consider the remaining 4 acts. Having seen first Hippolytus and then Phaedra confess their unlawful passions to trusted advisors in Act 1, we begin Act 2 with a third confession within this symmetrical dramatic structure. This one comes from Aricia, who confides to Esmene her secret love for Hippolytus. This immediately establishes her rivalry with Phaedra, who is also consumed with desire for him, though Aricia, of course, doesn't know this. Esme tells Aricia that Theseus has been reported dead, and she also observes that Hippolytus certainly doesn't behave as if he were her political enemy. This hint is all it takes for Aricia to reveal her desire. Esme observes, "His aspect did not tally with his fame. At the first glance from you, he grew confused. His eyes, seeking in vain to shun your gaze, brimming with languor, took their fill of you. Although the name of lover wounds his pride, he has a lover's eye, if not his tongue." Aricia's noted this too. "How avidly, Ismene, does my heart drink in these sweet, perhaps unfounded words," she says. "For as a lifelong enemy of love, I rendered thanks at first to Theseus's tyranny, which merely helped to keep me fancy-free. My eyes had not yet lighted on his son. Not that my eyes alone yield to the charm of his much-vaunted grace, his handsomeness bestowed by nature, but which he disdains and seems not even to realize that he owns." Now, Aricia puts up considerably less resistance to declaring her passion for Theseus than either Hippolytus or Phaedra do in their parallel scenes, where it requires considerably more coaxing to get them to acknowledge their desire. But the fact is that Aricia, too, is moved by the same law of desire that propels their longing. Her love is also, paradoxically, like theirs, aroused by the barriers to its fulfillment. In this case, there is, first, the enmity between Aricia's family and Hippolytus's family, specifically Theseus. Theseus overthrew Aricia's father, who had been the king of Athens. Second, while Theseus barred Aricia from ever marrying, she says that she was herself opposed to romantic love in general. Indeed, she calls herself, quote, "a lifelong enemy of love," before her eyes lighted on Hippolytus for the first time. Now, like Phaedra, she seems to have been overwhelmed with sexual desire at first seeing him, but only because she knew, as did Phaedra, that he was, after all, a man who had vowed to a life of chastity. And also, at first sight, she knew that he was her political enemy. Her desire, then, spurred in some ways by their political enmity and by Hippolytus's fame for his virginal code, by his disdain for women, intensified, brought that desire into being and intensified it. Now, Aricia notes that what was most attractive at all to her when she first saw him was that idea that he had pledged himself to a life of chastity. "I love, let me confess, that manly pride in him, which never yet had bowed beneath love's yoke," she says. "But to bring an unbending spirit down, like Hippolytus, to cause an aching where no feeling was, to stun a conqueror with his defeat, in vain revolt against a yoke he loves, that rouses my ambition, that rouses my desire." Now, unlike Phaedra, who craves Hippolytus because she wants sexual union with him and wants to be loved by him, Aricia, while she wants those things, also wants something else. She makes it clear here. She wants conquest, to overcome Hippolytus's pledge of virginity and his famous resistance to women. Far more than the political obstacle, it is his fierce celibacy as a barrier that roused her desire when she first saw him. It is a desire for him, but also a desire to make him renounce that pledge of sexlessness. Now, although Aricia is younger than Phaedra, she understands the law of desire that I've just described without having to have it explained to her. At this point, Hippolytus enters to tell Aricia that he is releasing her from the prohibition against marriage that his father imposed because he has heard that Theseus is dead. But Hippolytus goes further, and he urges Aricia to retake the throne of Athens that her family once held. This certainly comes as a surprise to her. He says, I can release you from a stern control, revoking laws whose harshness I deplore. Yourself, your heart, do with them what you will, but I won't make the claim to the throne. Why? My claim appears to be annulled by law, because my mother was an Amazon. But if my only rival for the throne were Phaedra's son, my stepbrother, I could protect my rights against the law's caprice. If I do not assert my claim, it is to hand, or rather to return to you, a scepter given to your ancestors. Now, Hippolytus, you'll remember, doesn't want Phaedra or her children to rule, because she has, after all, treated him cruelly. But why not rule himself then? Well, there are two reasons. Legally, he points out, he can't, because his mother was an Amazon, not an Athenian, and moreover, Theseus and this Amazon mother were not married. But the more important thing we should note here is that Hippolytus doesn't really want to rule. He has no political ambitions at all. He seems in this regard to have nothing in common with his power-hungry father, who fought to overthrow the previous king. Well, when Aricia expresses surprise at this unexpected support for her claim to the throne, Hippolytus seizes that chance to declare his love. It was this, above all things, that brought him to see this woman who he had been planning to flee from. And now, of course, it comes out. Hippolytus has been in an agonizing struggle against this love, but he's now unable to resist declaring it to its object. And thus, he says, Princess, I must go on. I must reveal a secret that my heart can no longer conceal. Before you stands a pitiable prince, single example of rush arrogance. I, who in proud rebellion against love have long mocked others' captive sufferings, who pitying the shipwrecks of the weak had thought to watch them always from the shore, am now in bondage to the common law, cut from my moorings by a surging swell. A single blow has quelled my recklessness. My haughty spirit is at last in thrall. For 6 long months, ashamed and in despair, pierced by the shaft implanted in my side, I battle with myself, with you in vain. Present, I flee you. Absent, you are near. Deep in the woods, your image follows me. Ah, do not scorn my clumsy gallantry, which but for you I would never have known of. Now, Hippolytus compares his sudden and uncontrollable surge of desire in the course of this declaration to a shipwreck, to a form of bondage, and to a source of despair. This is, I think you'll agree, not normally the kind of declaration that would be likely to melt a woman's heart. But Aricia delights in this because it feeds her sense of power in her own attractiveness, feeds her sense of power over this man who had been a sworn enemy of love. The idea that he cannot resist her delights her, especially because she is also in love with him. Now, Hippolytus' reference in that passage to the shaft of Cupid's arrow that has entered his side, that is entirely conventional in the language of love. But note that it is really a displacement of what is actually going on and originating within him. Like Phaedra, Hippolytus projects onto the gods, in this case Aphrodite and Cupid, what is really a compulsion that arises not outside himself, but from within, under the psychosexual law of attraction that compels us to crave that which is forbidden. Well, Aricia welcomes Hippolytus' declaration even more than she welcomes his political support. She thought that she'd have to work to conquer and seduce this young man, but she finds to her satisfaction that she has already succeeded. Now, what follows seems to be an arrangement between the two, wherein Hippolytus will work to secure the throne for Aricia, and Aricia in turn will accept his love, marry him, and rule Athens with his support. This is all implied, but it is never made explicit. The closest we come, I think, is in this passage, in which Aricia says, "Go, prince, pursue your generous designs," that is, on my behalf. "Make Athens' state pay homage to me. All the gifts you offer to me, I accept. but Athens' empire, glorious though it be, is not your most endearing offering. Clearly, his most endearing offering is not political power, but his love. But note, both Hippolytus's love for Aricia and his plan to return her to the throne subvert Phaedra's own hopes. Hippolytus still believes that Phaedra hates him at this point, not realizing that the reason she has exiled him from court was a failed attempt to subdue her longing for him by removing him. But of course, what she finds is that now the added barrier of distance has only increased her desire for him. Within the play's symmetrical design, you'll note that Racine establishes obvious correspondences and likenesses among Phaedra, Hippolytus, and Aricia. All three are overwhelmed by passionate desires that violate their lofty ideals of themselves. Second, for all three, these desires spring from what each considers most forbidden. And third, all three of them have to struggle to conceal their burning desire, and yet, finally unable to do so, confess it. Yet Hippolytus and Aricia certainly differ from Phaedra in two important ways. First, their desire is reciprocal, mutual. They are each passionately attracted to one another. And second, the barriers that both inspire and block their passion are less formidable than those that block and intensify Phaedra's. Those are, as we'll see in Phaedra's case, extreme prohibitions. Now, even if Theseus really were dead, and the barrier of adultery really were removed for Phaedra, the fact is that her desire would still be incestuous. And Phaedra is further horrified by her longing because she regards it not just as incestuous, but as a recurrence of the sexual perversity in her family history. She associates it with her sister Ariadne's self-destructive love for Theseus, and she associates it even more darkly with her mother Pasiphae's erotic obsession with and dalliance with a white bull. So Phaedra's guilt for her forbidden desire is then more intense and more hopeless than is Hippolytus's or Aricia's. And to make things still worse, we soon learn that Theseus really isn't dead. It's a false rumor. Now, that report that he was dead isn't a trick. It's not like the false claim of Orestes' death in Electra, strategically deployed. No, this is just a false rumor. But what makes Phaedra's love most impossible of all is, of course, that Hippolytus is repelled, both emotionally and morally, by that love for him when Phaedra declares it. This occurs in one of the play's greatest scenes, when Phaedra, at Oenone's urging, confesses to Hippolytus the passion that she has heretofore struggled to hide. You'll note that neither Theseus's wife or son, however, at this point, have mourned his supposed death. They haven't mourned it at all. They both view his demise as an opportunity to pursue their unlawful desires. So overwhelming are those desires. But even when Phaedra thinks that she is a widow, she still struggles to declare her feelings to Hippolytus. Her disclosure comes out in a way that is excruciating, indirect, and deeply perverse. First, Phaedra apologizes for alienating her stepson and sending him from the palace. Hippolytus assumed that she had driven him away because she feared that he would try to claim the throne and take it from the children of Theseus and her own union, because he was the firstborn son. But no, that was, of course, not the reason she exiled him at all. When Phaedra apologizes for driving him away, Hippolytus readily forgives her, noting, quote, "A mother is jealous of her children's rights and rarely forgives another woman's son." He's tremendously understanding. Yes, you're looking out for your own children. I can understand it now. That's, of course, what he imagines. But he's wrong. Hippolytus could never have imagined, never have believed, that the actual reason he was ostracized was that the mere sight of him filled Phaedra with painful, all-consuming, burning desire. Phaedra claims she wants to speak to Hippolytus at this moment so that they can share their mourning for the departed Theseus. But this is obviously a pretext, because as I've noted, neither of them heretofore seems grief-stricken at all. Nevertheless, the idea of a dead Theseus moves Phaedra to give voice to a strange, unsettling fantasy that certainly insinuates her passion for Hippolytus. We get this when she turns to him and, speaking of Theseus, says, "But no, Theseus is not dead. He lives in you. Always I think I see my husband's face. I see him, speak to him, and my fond heart, my frenzied love bursts forth in spite of me." Hippolytus doesn't know what's going on, but he finds this rather disquieting. He says, "In this I see the wonder of your love. Dead as he is, Theseus still lives in you. Still does his memory inflame your heart." To which she then responds, "Yes, Prince, I pine. I am on fire for him. I love King Theseus, not as once he was, the fickle worshipper at countless shrines dishonoring the couch of Hades' god, but constant, proud, and even a little shy, enchanting young, the darling of all hearts, fair as the gods, or fair as you are now. He had your eyes, your bearing, and your speech, his face flushed with your noble modesty." She goes on then to describe the following. If only you had been there in the past, you would have slain the monstrous Cretan bull, the Minotaur, despite the windings of his endless lair, the labyrinth. My sister Ariadne would have armed you with the thread to lead you through the dark entangled maze. No, I would have forestalled her, for my love would instantly have fired me with the thought. Only I, would have revealed to you the subtle windings of the labyrinth. What care I would have lavished on your head. I myself would have done it. A thread would not have reassured my fears, affronting danger side by side with you. No, I would myself have wished to lead the way, and Phaedra, with you in the labyrinth, would have returned with you or met her doom. Well, this is Phaedra's not entirely subtle way of telling Hippolytus that she loves him as an improved version of his father. That is, as something who physically resembles his father, but is in every other way better, unlike the philandering Theseus. He is pure. He's a noble male of the kind she wishes Theseus had been when her sister Ariadne fell in love with him on Crete, and when she, Phaedra herself, married him years before. She describes a man who looks a lot like Theseus and who is just as handsome and daring, but one who is, quote, a little shy and one of noble modesty. That is, Hippolytus, without specifically naming him at this point. Now, you'll note that he is, in this description, this ideal version of Theseus, in no way like the womanizing Theseus. He is, in fact, clearly Hippolytus. Like Orisha, Phaedra craves Hippolytus partly because of his reputation for chastity. She both values that reputation and that chastity, that manly purity, but also wants to be the woman to overcome it, though she is driven less by conquest, I think, than Orisha. In her fantasy of an alternate past, Phaedra casts herself sort of in the role that her sister played with regard to Theseus, and imagines that she and Hippolytus were approximately the same age. Now she's referring to Hippolytus as you. If Hippolytus, rather than Theseus, had prepared to face the Minotaur, Phaedra says she would have prevented her sister from giving him the spool of thread that Ariadne gave to Theseus that allowed him to kill the Minotaur and emerge following the thread out of the labyrinth again in which the monster was enclosed. No, she says, instead, as a demonstration of my love for you, I would have told my sister no, and I would have, rather than using a thread and given it to you, I would have entered the labyrinth with you, Hippolytus, to face that monster and, if necessary, meet my doom in doing so. Well, if only. This is a fantasy of what she wishes might have happened, an absolutely impossible one. Now, what is most perverse about this reimagining of a kind of alternate past, and what clearly disturbs Hippolytus as he listens to it, isn't just the realization that Phaedra is passionately in love with him. It is even more, that Phaedra's fantasy of the son taking the place of the father in this fantasy stresses the inherently incestuous nature of her desire. Earlier, she told Ononone that when she looked at Theseus, she could only see Hippolytus. Now she tells Hippolytus that when she looks at him, she sees her husband's face, or what she really sees is an improved version of her husband in the son, and it is that improved version, the son, that she desires. Well, hearing all this, Hippolytus is at first disbelieving, and then he is aghast. He reminds Phaedra that Theseus was his father, which makes her fantasy completely and totally inappropriate. He says, "What do I hear? Have you forgotten that King Theseus is my father? You, his wife?" And a moment later he says, "Forgive me." Blushing, "I confess your words were innocent, and perhaps I misunderstood. For very shame, I cannot bear your gaze. I must go." Well, the problem is that he did understand her words. Now, I noted last time that blushing is a key word and concept in this play. Both Hippolytus and Phaedra blush frequently. A blush, as I noted, can mean many things. It is, after all, physiologically a surge of blood under the skin that we can't control any more than the characters in this play can control their passion. But a blush is, as such then, an outward expression of something within that can betray either sexual desire or guilt or shame or some combination. Now, Hippolytus feels himself blushing at this moment because he is morbidly ashamed for Phaedra, but he's also ashamed for himself. And he even feels a certain guilt at this moment at finding himself the object of her unspeakable corrupt desire. It's as if he cannot bear her lustful gaze and asks if he can escape it and turn away from it, because he feels that that gaze of desire contaminates him, degrades him in his own eyes as its object, as if somehow he might feel he has done something to arouse it. Well, blushes are dangerous because they betray what one is very often trying to hide. As such, they are a form of exposure, but at the same time, blushes can be misinterpreted. Thus, Hippolytus breaks off his word in the passage I just read and wants to flee in mid-sentence, in part because he's embarrassed, but also because he doesn't want Phaedra to misread his blush as amorous, as an expression of his own desire or pleasure. Now, Hippolytus would also, even as he is fleeing, still like to convince himself that he is misinterpreting Phaedra's behavior somehow. But at that moment, as he tries to leave and still tries to convince himself that perhaps I'm misconstruing this, at that point, seeing this, she makes her declaration unbearably explicit. "Ah, cruel, you have understood only too well. I have revealed enough. Know Phaedra, then, and all her wild desires. I burn with love. Yet even as I speak, do not imagine I feel innocent, or think that my complacency has fed the poison of the love that clouds my mind. The hapless victim of heaven's vengeances, I loathe myself more than you ever will. The gods are witness that they who in my breast have lit the fatal fire in all my line. Those gods whose cruel glory it has been to lead astray a feeble mortal's heart, yourself recall to mind the past, and how I shunned you, cruel one, nay, drove you forth. I strove to seem to you inhuman, vile, the better to resist. I sought your hate, but what availed my needless sufferings? You hated me the more, I loved not less. Nay, this confession to you, ah, the shame! Think you I made it of my own free will? I meant to beg you, trembling, not to hate my helpless children, whom I dared not fail. My foolish heart, alas, too full of you, could talk to you of nothing but yourself. So take vengeance. Punish me for loving you. Come, prove yourself your father's worthy son, and in a vicious and of a vicious monster rid the world. I, Theseus' widow, dare to love his son. This frightful monster must not now escape. Here is my heart. Here must your blow strike home. Impatient to atone for its offense, I feel it strain to meet your mighty arm. Strike, or if it's unworthy of your blows, or such a death too mild for my deserts, or if you deem my blood too vile to stain your hand, lend me, if not your arm, your sword. Give it me. Oy, okay. Now, note that even though Phaedra admits feeling guilt and self-hatred for this passion, she also tries to project the cause of her passion, and therefore some of the guilt, onto the gods in order to reduce the sense of guilt that she bears, as if somehow they are punishing her. She calls it heaven's vengeance against her. But there is no plausible reason why the goddess of love, Aphrodite, would punish Phaedra as she punished her mother, Pasiphae, because as noted, Racine removes that motive from the myth. Hippolytus in this version has not spurned Aphrodite, and Aphrodite has not made Phaedra fall in love with him to punish him. No, in this play, desire originates from within, and in this case originates from within Phaedra. The speech suggests, however, another form of projection. Before the play opened, Phaedra treated Hippolytus with coldness, she acknowledges, and drove him away, as she explains, in an effort to control her longing. But also, we realize, she did it as a displacement of her self-contempt by projecting self-hatred onto him in the form of hatred, again, to try to reduce the guilt that she feels for the state of impassioned desire. Phaedra now understands that their mutual hostility, however, only made her desire grow. In short, Phaedra now articulates Racine's law of desire. As she puts it, the more you hated me for exiling you, the more I loved you at a distance. Now, when the beloved holds you in contempt, after all, that is yet another barrier that increases desire, and when the beloved is at a remove, that physical separation, again, as a barrier, intensifies longing. Now, these revelations, these confessions, lead to the play's most fascinating and perverse moment at the end of the speech that I read. When Phaedra sees Hippolytus's response to this declaration, and she's already gotten a sense of it even before she begins, when she sees his growing revulsion, she's consumed by two feelings. First, shame for what she has revealed, and second, acute disappointment, really almost grief, that Hippolytus is clearly appalled rather than aroused by her. Seeing his reaction, she urges him then to end her misery and stab her to death with his sword, to punish her for her egregious desire. But of course, there's much more going on here. Indeed, when Hippolytus holds back from stabbing her, she then takes the sword and points it, holding the blade, at her own breast. And we have to ask then, what precisely is going on when she speaks of his sword? Lend me your sword, hand it me, if not your arm, your sword, give it to me. Well, when Phaedra declares that she would like to die, with phrases like, quote, strike home with your blow, and, quote, I strain to meet your mighty arm, and, quote, give it me, when she says she wants to die using that language, she clearly wants something more than death, or in addition to death. She wants to be sexually penetrated by Hippolytus. She wants to receive his manly thrusts. The sword is a phallic substitute for what she most craves, but fears she may never possess. Now, the French audience would have understood this relationship between eros and death very clearly. In France, orgasm is called la petite mort. It's called the little death. Similarly, in Shakespeare's England, the word die has a double meaning. It's a double entendre for sex. Now, Freud theorized late in his career in the 1920s and beyond the pleasure principle that human life was driven by a conflict between two enormous forces. He called them eros and thanatos. Eros is the drive toward sex, thanatos the drive toward death. Freud believed that these two were in a constant battle within the human psyche. Eros pushing us towards sensate life and the pursuit of sexual gratification, thanatos, on the other hand, driving us toward extinction and a return to a state of non-being. These oppositional drives operate in Phaedra because she feels that she either has to gratify her forbidden lust or embrace death. We've seen that up until now. But the remarkable thing about this moment is now Eros and Thanatos, the desire for sex and the desire for self-extinction, actually come together in the end of this scene, because Phaedra, in her passionate despair, longs for the dual consummation of sex and death, or death in sex, if you will, in a single moment of male penetration. Phaedra also wants something else here. It's not just sex and death, or death through sex, but also a punishment for her desire in the process. Thus, she says, "Punish me for loving you." She cries that, and she compares herself to, quote, a vicious monster, like the Minotaur that Theseus slew. She's a vicious monster. She feels monstrous because of her illicit, incestuous desire. Now, again, you'll note, in talking to Hippolytus here, even as she decries the monstrousness, the perversity of her desire, she stresses the incestuous aspect of her attraction, precisely because that is so much a source of her desire, the fact that it is incestuous. Thus, she pleads, quote, "Prove yourself your father's worthy son." That is, penetrate me as your father has penetrated me. Hippolytus' response to this desperate appeal provides none of the things that she is crying out for. He refuses to give her sex, or death, or even punishment. Instead, Hippolytus is so astounded and so horrified at this moment that he runs away, leaving his sword in Phaedra's hands, pointed still by her at her own breast. Now, like Desdemona's failure to retrieve the handkerchief that Othello knocked from her hand, you'll recall, this particular dereliction also proves to be a fatal mistake, not taking with him his sword, because when Theseus returns, Theseus assumes that Hippolytus gave the sword to his wife as a token of their illicit love. Now, having fled Phaedra in this moral panic, Hippolytus feels tainted as the object of incestuous desire. He feels guilty and ashamed for having somehow unintentionally aroused this feeling in his stepmother. Running away doesn't dissipate that sense of guilt. He finds her desire, indeed, as she does, monstrous, but he knows at the same time that he can no longer affirm his own sexual purity and moral high ground because of his own illicit passion for Aricia. This, in some ways, ought to make him more sympathetic to Phaedra, but it instead merely makes him feel guilty and hypocritical. "Flee, flee," he says to himself. "Flee, Theramenes. I cannot speak, nor without horror look upon myself. Phaedra, no, mighty God, let us consign this shameful secret to oblivion. Let us depart, Theramenes, and at whatever cost place the scepter in more worthy hands." Okay. Now, Hippolytus, you'll note, is uncomfortable with the scepter, if you will, in any form. He's uncomfortable with political power. He doesn't want that. He wants to place it in Aricia's hand, but he's also uncomfortable with the scepter, often evoked as a kind of phallic image itself, in that he's uncomfortable with his passion for Aricia. He cannot deny it. He has declared it, but certainly after seeing what passion has done to his stepmother, it can only make him all the more uncomfortable with his own. Now, at this point, we hear a rumor that at the end of Act 2, Theseus is not really dead, but alive. And with this, all plans that have been predicated by Hippolytus and Phaedra on Theseus's absence suddenly must turn in a new direction. Act 3. Well, Act 3 opens with Phaedra revealing extreme emotional vacillations. At first, shame dominates. She feels humiliated and exposed, absolutely mortified. Oenone urges her to forget Hippolytus, who has rejected her, and instead concentrate on ruling. She notes Hippolytus' cold response and suggests, of course, that he is unworthy of her and that her mistress should get back to being the queen. Should you not aspire to seek your peace of mind in nobler cares, Phaedra? Resort to flight from an ungrateful youth, reign and assume the guidance of the state. You know, why pursue him? He left you well nigh prostrate at his feet. How odious his uncompromising pride is. Just forget him. Now, Phaedra tells Oenone that she cannot follow her advice and get on with the business of ruling Athens in Theseus's absence because she can't even govern her own feelings. She replies, quote, I reign, I bring a state beneath my rule when reason reigns no longer over me, when I have lost my self-domination. I hope in reading this you were reminded of Othello's words of farewell to his role as military commander when he found that he had lost all emotional self-control. Well, Phaedra's guilt is nearly as intense as her shame, okay? Remember that shame is something we feel in relation to the judgment of others when our transgressions are exposed. Guilt, on the other hand, is a private transaction with her own conscience. She feels both. And the guilt she feels is due to the fact that she cannot forgive herself for the desire within, which, as we've seen, violates her rather lofty principle that she will never fall prey to the sexual depravity of her mother. Now, however, instead of trying to project blame for that passion which has filled her with guilt onto the gods in order to diminish the guilt, instead, she also doesn't try to blame Hippolytus. Rather now, having projected it in the past onto both the gods and Hippolytus and blame them, she tries to diminish her guilt by projecting the cause of her woe and, for that matter, even her passion, onto Oenone. She accuses her maid of encouraging her to declare herself to Hippolytus and thereby heightening or amplifying the love that she was trying to suppress. Now, there is some truth to this. Oenone did encourage her to declare her love, but she did it, after all, to save Phaedra's life. Still, Phaedra says, he now knows my mad desires, Hippolytus. I have transgressed the bounds of modesty. I to Hippolytus have bared my shame, and hope to spite me has seduced my heart. But you yourself, rallying my failing strength when on my lips my soul was hovering, by guileful counsels brought me back to life. You gave me glimpses of a sinless love. You led me on. You made me do it. But even stronger than Phaedra's shame and guilt, which she tries to deflect, even stronger than those two feelings at this moment, is her enduring passion for Hippolytus. Predictably, his rejection of her has only intensified that desire by creating yet another seemingly insuperable barrier to its fulfillment. So when Oenone, trying to comfort Phaedra, says perhaps Hippolytus' silence wasn't so much rejection, but merely the reaction of one, quote, who was shocked, and that it, quote, mirrored his surprise at your violent declaration. When she proposes this dubious reading of Hippolytus's inability to speak and his stuttering and his departure, when she proposes it, so overwhelmed still with desire for him is Phaedra that she clings to this slender hope. She wants to be deceived by her maid, and she even reminds herself, after Oenone makes this suggestion, that Hippolytus couldn't possibly, at least, be interested in other women, fierce virginal youth that he is. Thus, she tries to egg herself on to hope by noting that at least I wouldn't have a rival. Well, we savor of the dramatic irony here, of course, because we know differently. Clinging to these false hopes, Phaedra hatches a strategy to try to win Hippolytus in a new way, not by appealing to his sexual desire as she had tried and failed to do before, but now to try to win him by appealing to what she takes to be his ambition, by appealing to his pity for her, little knowing that indeed she does have a rival. But she is so desperate that she begins to hatch these new approaches. Untitled says, it's true. He hates all women with a deadly hate, to which Phaedra says, no rival then will triumph over me. If he is inaccessible to love, then, let us attack him at some weaker point. He seemed attracted to an empire's rule. He could not hide it. Well, she's wrong about that too, but Onanone, let us play on his ambition. Go, dazzle him with the glitter of the crown. Let him assume the sacred diadem, myself to bind it on all I ask, yielding to him the power I could not hold. He will instruct my son how to command. Perhaps he will be father to the boy. Mother and son I will commit to him. In short, try every means to win him round. Your words will find a readier ear than mine. Urge him, weep, paint Phaedra's at death's door. You may assume a supplicating tone. I will endorse it. Do whatsoever you do. All right. Now, note that Phaedra, having suggested trying to buy Hippolytus's love and marriage by offering him the crown, and also by appealing to his sense of pity for this poor woman whom he had left as an emotional wreck, she has a backup plan, because she concludes that if these two strategies fail to win him, that all that would be left would be an appeal to the goddess of love herself, who she hopes would force Hippolytus to desire her, as she tells herself Aphrodite has forced her to love Hippolytus. In a soliloquy, then, Phaedra prays to Aphrodite. She says, your name seems to offend his haughty ear. Goddess, avenge yourself on him. Our cause is one, yours and mine. Make him love me. In short, she prays to the goddess of love, do to him what you did to me. Clearly, there are no limits to Phaedra's desperation. Her passion overpowers guilt and shame, and certainly overpowers reason. But the fact that Aphrodite, or Venus as she was known in Roman myth, the fact that she doesn't answer Phaedra's prayer reminds us, of course, that the desire we find within her and within every character in this play is not something brought about by divine agency, but rather something that arises within the individual, sinfully within the individual as far as Racine is concerned. Now, at this moment, Onanone rushes in with the unwelcome news that Theseus is in fact not dead but alive, and even worse, he is about to arrive back home at the palace. With all of this, Phaedra's hopes that she has just formulated are suddenly dashed, and a new threat of shame emerges for her. What if Theseus finds out that she declared her love to his son? As Phaedra puts it, quote, I have confessed a love that soils my husband's name. But it's not just a new threat of shame that Phaedra feels here with the news of Theseus's impending return. It is also a profound fear. Phaedra is afraid that Hippolytus will tell Theseus about their terrible encounter. In this respect, her son-in-law now seems to her, quote, a fearful monster in my eyes. The word monster she had used to describe her own illicit passion is now applied to him as someone who could expose that passion. Now, even if Hippolytus doesn't tell his father about her declaration, Phaedra fears that when she meets the returning Theseus, her own blush will somehow incriminate her, that her own blush will reveal what she has been trying so hard to conceal. Thus, she is afraid to meet him. She thinks, mindful of Theseus' honor as Hippolytus is, Will he conceal from him my fierce desires? Will he be false to his father and to the king, restrain the horror that he feels for me? His silence would be vain, Onononi, for I know my baseness, and do not belong to those cold wretches who with brazen form can revel in their crimes unblushingly. I know my transports and recall them all. Yeah, she's afraid that her blushes will give her away, even if Hippolytus doesn't say anything, and even if she doesn't say anything. Well, note that at this time, when Phaedra does unavoidably meet Theseus, sure enough, because she is afraid of what her blush might disclose, she tries to hide her face from him in order to avoid any suggestion of a blush confessing a crime. She says upon meeting her husband, quote, I am unworthy to approach you, and only only ask that I may be allowed to hide. You can imagine why Theseus, after 6 months away, is perplexed by this curious homecoming. Now, Phaedra's strange evasion here in meeting Theseus comes at the same time that Hippolytus also asks his newly returned father to allow him to, quote, disappear. Neither Phaedra nor Hippolytus can bear to look at Theseus because they feel so disturbed by the encounter. The encounter fills them both with a sense of guilt and with a fear that their meeting will be somehow revealed by their conduct. Now, in this state of shame and guilt, in this state of rejection and fear, all of these terrible emotions surging within her, it's not surprising that Phaedra, once again, would like to end her life. She had earlier in the play, before Onononi encouraged her to declare her love to Hippolytus, now she desires it again. Then death, she says, come, free me from so many woes. Is it so terrible to cease to live? Death holds no terrors for the wretched. No, I fear only the name I leave behind for my poor children. What a heritage! A mother's crime lies heavy on her sons, and I tremble lest reports, alas, too true, one day upbraid them with a mother's guilt. Now, you'll note then, she hesitates to take her own life, though she deeply desires it, because she is afraid that her children would be tainted by her suicide. And even if Hippolytus doesn't publicize her illicit desire, she is also afraid that at some point after her death, it would come out and her children would pay the price for her transgressive desire. So, fearing that and wanting to protect her children, she's paralyzed, unable to go on living in the misery of shame, guilt, rejection, and fear, but also unable to bring herself to commit suicide at this point. As she says, quote, my whirling mind has left me powerless. Well, seeing this condition and pitying Phaedra, as she always does, and fearing that Phaedra's inner turbulence will destroy her, Onononi once again intervenes in an attempt to trouble her mistress, to ease her mistress's troubled mind. She advises Phaedra that before Hippolytus or her own blushes can give away her desire for Hippolytus to Theseus, that instead she should blame Hippolytus, blacken his name by accusing him of lusting after her. Now, why, you ask, does Onononi do this? She isn't an evil woman at heart, but she's so devoted to Phaedra that she can't stand to see her racked with desperate fear. She also believes that Phaedra's honor is on the line here, if the truth came out, and that the only sure way to preserve Phaedra's honor then is to lie by accusing Hippolytus of Phaedra's own crime, which is precisely what she proposes when she says, but since without this remedy you die, for me your life must come before all else. But even if guiltless blood must still be shed, what does your threatened honor not demand? It is too precious to be compromised. It dictates all of them must be obeyed. And to safeguard your honor, Phaedra, everything, yes, even virtue, must be sacrificed. But who comes here? 'Tis Theseus. Yes. Now, Onanone miscalculates here. She doesn't realize that Hippolytus's own sense of honor and his desire to save his father's feelings will prevent him from disclosing Phaedra's passion for him. Yet, Hippolytus, in his own way, does lie to Theseus when they meet. It's not just that he suppresses the information, but he also lies in a certain way for all of his nobility. He asks his father if he can leave so that he can go off on conquests and thereby prove his manly mettle the way Dad did. Now, this isn't, of course, Hippolytus's motive at all for wanting to get away. Rather, he wants to get away because he's afraid his father will find out that he loves Aricia. And so he hopes to, in some way, gain the father's approval for departing by appealing on grounds that he thinks Theseus will certainly approve. He says, "And I, a glorious father's unknown son, lack far behind even my mother's deeds. Let me at least now show you my mettle, father, and if some fell monster has escaped your sword, place it at your feet in honorable spoils." Yes, if there are any monsters you haven't killed, let me go out and do it. Let me show you what I'm capable of. This is his excuse for wanting to get away. You remember at the beginning, he offered an excuse for Theramenes to wanting to leave, which was go out to find Theseus. Both of them, of course, are false. Theseus flatly refuses this request to go away. And he now explains, Theseus does, why he has been away for so many months. He explains that he was imprisoned in the underworld by the god Hades because his friend, Theseus's friend, Pirithous, tried to abduct Hades' wife Persephone, whom the god of the underworld had earlier abducted himself. But Theseus' support of his friend here in abducting a woman was misguided because they were found out, and both of them were imprisoned when the plot was foiled. This story does not reflect well on Theseus, especially given his own dubious relations to women. Helping steal another man's wife doesn't look good. But now that he is back, Theseus is understandably disgruntled because neither his son nor his wife can stand, it seems, to be in his presence. They both want to get away. This is not the homecoming that he expected. And so he is suspicious. And so suspicious that he says to his son, "But when I joyfully prepare to meet my dearest ones, and all the gods have spared, nay, when my soul, that is, its own again, would feast itself upon so dear a sight, only with shudders am I welcomed home. Everyone flees, rejecting my embrace." What's going on? Well, hearing this and seeing his father's anger and agitation, and seeing also that his father is understandably suspicious because of this strange conduct he's receiving, Hippolytus is aware that Theseus could erupt at any moment, particularly if he learned, quote, how love has spread its baleful poison through the house. Okay, that is, Theseus could erupt if he understood Hippolytus' own love or if he understood the love of Phaedra. Now, when he speaks of the baleful poison through the house, he's referring both to his desire for Aricia and to Phaedra's desire for him. Hippolytus, however, cannot and will not renounce his love for Aricia. But he concludes that as a man of honor, since he cannot leave, he must no longer hide that love from the king, his father, who is, we know, Aricia's political enemy. And in a soliloquy, Hippolytus says that, quote, "Mine is a love my father may oppose, but which it is not in his power to change." In short, having first tried and failed to flee, Hippolytus is now willing to risk confessing a transgressive love to Theseus in a way that Phaedra is clearly not willing to confess her transgressive love to him. He hopes, if nothing else, that his honesty will, as he puts it, revive my father's tenderness. Because remember, the two of them were partly estranged from the very beginning of the play, largely because of Phaedra's interference. Okay, Act 4 begins with Theseus in a rage because while Hippolytus was soliloquizing, Oenone, in a scene we did not see but hear about, Oenone had told Theseus that Hippolytus lusts after his wife. Now, this is not just a false claim, of course, but it is an absolute reversal of the truth. Oenone also, in this encounter apparently, tries to gain good favor with Theseus, to get in his good graces, by telling him that Phaedra was on the verge of suicide because of Hippolytus's vicious passion for her, but that she, as the faithful servant, preserved her for your love, sir. Okay, your wife is alive thanks to me. Now, you'll note that Racine makes a point of having Oenone give this accusation against Hippolytus when Phaedra is too distracted to resist whatever plans Oenone is hatching for her. And I mention this because, as I've noted, in Euripides' version of the tragedy, Phaedra tells Theseus the lie herself. She says, yes, your son desires me. But Racine spares her the guilt of the foul deed of false testimony, as he explained in his preface, because he says such a lie would have been, quote, somewhat too low in the mouth of a princess whose sentiments are otherwise noble and virtuous. Still, Phaedra, we must remember, does approve of Oenone's plan to make this false accusation, and thus she bears some guilt without question for it. Moreover, in Racine's view, Phaedra's perverted desire for her stepson alone is enough of a character flaw to counterbalance her virtues. Now, Racine doesn't want to make her a liar because, as he explains, the audience's tragic emotions of pity and fear depend upon our emotional identification with her, and if she were a liar, in addition to being overwhelmed with lust, we might not be able to summon that sense of sympathetic identification. He wants to preserve that, even though from a Jansenist point of view, Phaedra is doomed for her moral depravity and deserves to be. But the key is that for Racine, her struggle against that depravity must be sufficiently noble and heroic that it creates our sympathy. And dishonesty, a lie directed against Hippolytus, he thinks would render that noble struggle that is the key to her tragedy null and void. Well, after Oenone's accusation, Theseus reflects on the strange behavior of his wife and son in private. He recalls that when he saw Phaedra, she was still holding Hippolytus' sword. She wouldn't face him. She had said she had to go away, but she's still gripping this sword in much the same way she has been holding on to and unavoidably gripping her desire for Hippolytus. She can't let go of either. Well, like Othello, seeing the handkerchief in Cassio's hand, Theseus doesn't understand the context when he sees the sword in Phaedra's hand. And so he misreads this as a piece of incriminating evidence. It seems to support Oenone's accusation of Hippolytus's lust for his wife. He says, beginning of Act 4, "What do I hear? A reckless libertine conceived this outrage on his father's name. How harshly you accuse me, destiny! I know not where I am, whither I go. O son, O ill-rewarded tenderness! I recognize the sword he drew on her. That sword I gave him for a nobler cause. Could all the ties of blood not hold him back?" Well, based on Oenone's lie, which she has just presented before the scene opens, Theseus assumes that Hippolytus drew the sword to threaten Phaedra to have sex with him, and this would be a violation, as he puts it, of blood ties. Specifically, Theseus thinks that Hippolytus has violated 3 blood ties: those of marriage, the avoidance of incest, and a son's duty to his father, in what he imagines was this attempt to force sex at sword point, he's violated all of those sacred blood ties. So from Theseus' perspective then, it is a triple betrayal on Hippolytus' part. Now, Oenone's false testimony helps to propel the tragedy, and we might even think here of Iago. It is true that she is promoting her own interest, but I think there are two major differences that we must be aware of. First, unlike Iago, who is wholly selfish, Oenone is acting mainly on Phaedra's behalf because she is devoted to her, more on Phaedra's behalf than her own. And the second difference is this: Oenone is capable of guilt and remorse, which later drive her to suicide, while Iago had no conscience at all. In both respects, Oenone's dishonesty is really closer to Emilia's less malign act of withholding information about the missing handkerchief. Meanwhile, Theseus's jealous rage recalls Othello's, and also, like Othello, Theseus cannot bear the anguish of uncertainty. One wonders indeed if Racine had Othello in mind here in this portrait of Theseus. Like Othello, Theseus wishes he could see Hippolytus' sexual guilt clearly and absolutely, so he would know for sure, rather than having a state of uncertainty and having to search for signs in order to corroborate Oenone's claims about his son's conduct. He says at the beginning of scene 2, must needs the brow of an adulterer be bright with virtue's sacred character? And ought we not by fixed and certain signs to see into perfidious mortal hearts? Why aren't there outward signs that could make us clear? Like Othello, he's unable to live in doubt. And like Othello, he acts rashly, almost as rashly as Othello does. When he sees Hippolytus the next time, he calls him monster. That key word continues to recur, in this case as a description of what he takes to be his son's perverted sexuality. When he issues then a devastating condemnation, it is to punish this monstrousness. And what a condemnation. He says, the frenzy of your wicked lust has driven you to assault your father's bed. Flee, villain, flee. Brave not my hatred here, nor tempt my anger that I scarce restrain. I have my portion of eternal shame, to have begotten so criminal a son as you. Flee, and if you desire not to be joined to all the villains fallen by my hand, take care that never does the shining sun behold you in these palaces again. Flee then, and never more return. And of your hideous presence purge my realm. And Neptune, now he invokes the sea god, I call upon you now, revenge my wrong, I give this villain over to your wrath, drown in his blood his shameless foul desires. Oh dear. Well, what does he do? He banishes Hippolytus from Athens, he disowns him as a son, and he threatens him with death if he returns. But then, worked up this way, he offers at the end of this denunciation the most terrible expression of his rage. He invokes the wrath of Neptune. Now, Theseus clearly cannot bear the idea of killing his own son. That would be a violation of blood. So he calls instead on the sea god to avenge his wrong. And this invocation seals Hippolytus' doom. And it is the one occasion in the play in which there does seem to be a supernatural occurrence. Neptune does intervene. But it's not just a supernatural intervention. The monster that arises from the sea is also an embodiment of Theseus's madness and jealous rage, and also an embodiment of Phaedra's monstrous lust. Well, Theseus' denunciation of Hippolytus in this blind, jealous rage seems extreme. He won't even listen to his son. Why is it so extreme? Well, there are a couple of reasons, I think. First, Hippolytus' life of purity was, remember, partly a reaction against Theseus' sexual profligacy. But now Theseus sees his earlier sins reflected and magnified in what he takes to be the erotic crimes that he is accusing his son of. The idea that Hippolytus lusted after Phaedra causes Theseus to feel horror and self-contempt for his own erotic excesses as a young man, and now he punishes Hippolytus in part in extremity in order to dissociate himself from his own earlier crimes. The language suggests this. He says, Go out and seek friends who in their viciousness applaud adultery and incest. Go, libertine, before a father's wrath has you with ignominy torn from hence. Now, Theseus knows very well, indeed, how he could sire a child that he claims to wonder how he could have reproduced. Because, of course, this child, to his mind, is sexually transgressive, much as he himself had been. But he doesn't want to acknowledge that in any way there is part of his bloodline that might have contributed to what he takes Hippolytus to be. Thus the extremity of response as a reaction against his own sense of guilt in the past. But a second reason for the extremity of this rage is that Theseus can't get over specifically the incestuous aspect, the usurpation of his bed, as he puts it, by his own son. Here again, Racine anticipates Freud, not the theory of Eros and Thanatos, but an earlier theory, Freud's Oedipal theory, which he formulated over 200 years after this play was written. According to this family romance, a father and his son both desire the mother sexually. It's a rivalry Freud saw originating in a young man's very early life, and one that he saw deeply woven into the male psyche. Now, even though Phaedra is Hippolytus' stepmother, Theseus might well feel particularly threatened within the Oedipal competition because he is no longer a young man like Hippolytus. Indeed, there might even be a kind of waning of Theseus' legendary sexual potency. Hippolytus protests his innocence in two ways, but hopelessly. First, he reminds Theseus of his renowned life of chastity and austerity. He says, "I hate the crime you accuse me of," and observes that, quote, "daylight is not purer than my heart." The second way he tries to defend himself against the claim that he has attempted to coerce and seduce Phaedra is one that more or less contradicts the first claim that I've just described. After declaring that he couldn't possibly desire a woman because he's so pure, he then says, well, I couldn't possibly desire Phaedra because actually I'm in love with someone else. I'm in love with Aricia. No, father, for this may not be concealed. I have not scorned to glow with virtuous love, and at your feet now confess my real offense. I am in love despite your ban. Aricia is my mistress, the mistress of my heart. Now, you'll note that Hippolytus calls this a virtuous love, echoing the same words Theramenes used, even though he also regards this love as, quote, an offense. And even though Racine himself says in the preface that we should regard Hippolytus' desire for Aricia as, quote, a weakness, an aberrant passion. Now, Theseus immediately rejects Hippolytus' confession as a lie, as, quote, a ruse to disguise his real passion for Phaedra. Now, it does seem unlikely that Hippolytus would love the family enemy, so perhaps there's some grounds for Theseus' doubt there. But on the other hand, it's just as unlikely that this man of chastity would desire his own stepmother. Somehow, Theseus is willing to believe that. Clearly, then, Theseus is not thinking clearly or rationally, and he fatally mistakes his son's honesty and innocence here for practiced deceit. But even after Theseus has disowned Hippolytus, still Hippolytus doesn't accuse Phaedra in order to defend himself against the accusation of his monstrous lust for her. The closest Hippolytus comes to hinting at Phaedra's depravity is this. It's a hint, and his father doesn't pick up on it. He says to Theseus, "You harp on incest and adultery. I will say not. But Phaedra, as you know, my lord, is of a mother of a line richer in all those horrors than my own." Yeah, if you want to think about a bloodline that might produce sexual depravity, you might think about her. He reminds Theseus of Phaedra's lineage, of the mother's dalliance with the bull. Horrors he implies she might have inherited, but he'll go no further. He won't accuse her. And we have to wonder then, why? Why hold back and suffer the consequences? Well, he keeps silent about Phaedra's declaration of love, not to protect Phaedra, but rather, after all, he regards Phaedra as his enemy, but rather to protect Theseus. He still loves his father despite the unjust treatment he's receiving. He wants to spare Theseus's feelings and Theseus's reputation, and he explains this later to Aricia when she asks him what we would ask, which is why he's withholding the truth about a woman who is his enemy, to which he simply says, when she says, "From what caprice will you let Phaedra's slander hold the field? Why, you should tell Theseus all." Hippolytus replies, "What have I not said? Should I make known the outrage to his bed, and by an all too frank confession bring over my father's brow a blush of shame? Let's trust the justice of the gods above. Their interest lies in vindicating me. Sooner or later, Phaedra will be brought to book and meet an ignominious doom." Well, it might strike you that he is impossibly noble here, trying to save his father from shame and emotional upset after the way, particularly, Theseus has just treated him. But Racine insists that Hippolytus is not a totally good man because, after all, of his desire for Aricia, which we're supposed to regard as a sin, as a weakness. Well, maybe from a Jansenist point of view one can do so, but most viewers, I think, find the idea that his virtuous love for this woman, Aricia, is sinful, difficult to swallow. And Racine himself, paradoxically, makes us root for the fulfillment of their mutual love. Thus, in some ways, Racine seems divided against his own intentions. Meanwhile, his prediction that the gods will bring a just punishment to Phaedra and vindicate him proves to be misguided, in part because there seemed to be very little interference of the gods at all in this play. Meanwhile, Phaedra hears of Hippolytus's banishment and is stricken now with another source of guilt. Now the guilt for causing this terrible father-son rift, both with her passion and with the lie that she allowed Onanone to tell. She fears that she is responsible, quote, for causing bloodshed by a father's hand. Indeed she is. Now, at the same time as Hippolytus flees Athens, Phaedra is also stricken with grief at the thought that she will never see him again. So she pleads with Theseus on the basis of blood ties to, quote, spare your son, respect your flesh and blood, I beg of you. She wants both to save Hippolytus, but also to bring him back to be near her. Well, Theseus refuses her appeal, as he had rejected Hippolytus's appeal to leave on his own. But then Theseus mentions that Hippolytus told him of his love for Aricia, and suddenly, on hearing this, Phaedra is seized by a new dominant emotion. Now it's not guilt or loss, but jealousy. It's as if she has caught this contagion of jealousy almost from Theseus. She tortures herself with envy in a soliloquy, and now Phaedra's jealousy is stronger even than her guilt. Having a rival creates a new barrier, and so, of course, only amplifies her impossible longing for Hippolytus. As she dwells and dwells upon it, she thinks, upon hearing this, Hippolytus can love, but loves not me. Aricia has won his heart, his troth. Another, nonetheless, has conquered him. She has found favor in his cruel eyes. And she thinks a moment later, their love will always live. Even as I speak, cruel, deadly thought, they flout the fury of my insane rage. Despite this exile which sever them, they swear 1,000 oaths never to part. No, their happiness is gall to me. Onanone, pity my wild jealousy. Aricia must perish, and the king be stirred to wrath against her odious race. Now, at this point, Phaedra has reached the apex of her suffering. She is overwhelmed by, I think we might say, 5 different powerful emotions that seem to take turns dominating in her. First, there is shame for exposing her illicit desire to Hippolytus. Second, there is fear that Theseus will find out about this forbidden desire. Third, there is guilt for permitting a lie that prompted Theseus's destructive rage at his son. Fourth, there is grief at Hippolytus' lifetime banishment and the likelihood that she will never see him again. And finally now, fifth, there is jealousy of Aricia, which only increases her feeling of shame and desire. All of these emotions are warring in Phaedra's breast, and they give rise to her greatest soliloquy, in which she again longs for death. Now she says, "What am I doing? I've lost my mind. I jealous, and to Theseus I implore. My husband is alive, and yet I pine for whom? Whose heart have I been coveting? At every word my hair stands on end. Henceforth the measure of my crimes is full. I reek with the foulest incest and deceit." "Oh, I want to die," she says. "Oh, Minos judges in hell, the trembling dead. Ah, how his horror-stricken shade will start to see before him in hell his own daughters stand, forced to admit to such a host of sin, and some perhaps unknown even in hell. What father will you say to that dread sight? I see your hands slip from the fateful urn. I see you searching for new punishments, the fruits of crimes whose dark shame follows me. Oh, dogged by misfortune to my dying breath, I end upon the rack a life of pain, and vows to die." Now, you'll note that we find here, I think, the strongest elements of Jansenism in the entire play. First, this terrible, intense, excruciating examination of conscience and confrontation with her own guilt, dwelling upon her own intrinsic sinfulness. Then, also, there is the assignment of her soul to eternal damnation as fitting and just punishment for her sins, very much as Jansenists believed we should all do, unless we are somehow fortunately saved. She condemns herself in the passage I read to the realm of Hades and asks her father, Minos, who is a judge in Hades, to find her guilty there and to punish her. Well, this is the moment of her greatest moral self-awareness. It is what would be Aristotle's moment of tragic self-recognition. Because at this moment, Phaedra no longer blames the gods for her passion. She no longer projects it onto them, only herself. But then something surprising occurs. A moment later, she retreats from this self-honesty and from the full acceptance of moral responsibility that we've just seen in this declaration by blaming Onenone again. She accuses her maid now both of lying about Hippolytus and encouraging her to confess her passion to him. Quote, "You may have killed him," she says. Is this really fair? Hardly. Onenone didn't make Phaedra love Hippolytus, and she encouraged her to pursue that love by telling him only in order to save Phaedra's life. Falsely accusing Hippolytus was her idea, and it was definitely wrong, but Onenone did it with Phaedra's consent, and again, only to save her life and to protect her honor. So it isn't a fair accusation, and yet Onenone is crushed by this accusation because it comes from a woman that she's devoted her life to, whom she loves. Onenone is, in short, much harder on herself, I think, than we are. She regards Phaedra's rebuke as just, and she consigns herself to self-inflicted death as a result. Onenone says, quote, "This is the reward I have deserved." We turn now to Act 5, which begins with Hippolytus telling Aricia that he trusts divine justice will punish Phaedra and reveal his innocence to Theseus during his banishment. Quote, "The justice of the gods above will vindicate me." All right, well, unfortunately, as I noted, this vindication doesn't happen, certainly while he's alive, and it doesn't involve the gods anyway. But from Racine's severe Jansenist perspective, Hippolytus doesn't deserve to be exonerated because of his passion for Aricia, which really is sinful, notwithstanding their moving love for one another. Hippolytus urges her to run away with him and marry him, with vows that they would make at a shrine of their own. And indeed, Aricia says yes, she will follow him, because after all, who can resist young love? And Racine makes it very difficult at this moment then to think of this as anything other than a virtuous love, because the two are so committed to one another against such odds. Now, many would say that Racine's presentation of their relationship then works against his own moral intention of making all passion appear sinful. And I do think that in some way this is a play that is deeply divided against itself. Well, Hippolytus makes Aricia promise while he is away, not to disclose Phaedra's passion for him, or to mention that her servant slandered him, because he is still trying to protect his father's feelings. Aricia agrees, but like Hippolytus, when she sees Theseus, she too drops a hint about Phaedra, just enough of a hint to cause Theseus to fall back into a state of agonizing uncertainty. Indeed, although she does not ever mention Phaedra's name, she causes him to use the exact same phrase, the exact same metaphor for his state of uncertainty that Othello used when he was under Iago's influence. Theseus says that these hints, quote, have put me back on the rack despite my stern resolve, the rack of doubt. In fact, Theseus now feels, quote, a lurking flash of pity for the son that he's just banished. What if he's not guilty? But note, it's now too late, because he has already, Theseus, summoned Neptune's vengeance, and that vengeance cannot be recalled. Something else comes too late as well, and that is Phaedra's decision to confess her guilt to Theseus. But she does it. Both her passion for Hippolytus and the slanderous lies she allowed Onunu to tell, both of these she now discloses to her husband. Unfortunately, by the time she summons up the courage to do this, she has, however, an additional source of guilt on her hands, which is Hippolytus's death. As in Greek drama, we learn about this death in a messenger's report rather than seeing it. It worked this way. As Hippolytus was driving his horses in exile along the shore, a monster summoned by Neptune through Theseus's invocation arose out of the sea and terrified the horses. And now there rose upon the liquid plain a watery mountain, seething furiously. The surge drew near, dissolved, and vomited a raging monster from among the foam. Half bull, half dragon, wild, impetuous, his crupper curved in many a winding fold. Hippolytus alone, undaunted, stayed, reined in his steeds, and seized his javelins, held at the monster, and with sure-flung dart dealt it a gaping wound deep in its flank. But alas, it has stirred his horses. Carried away by terror, deaf, the steeds no more responded to his curb or voice. Their master spent his efforts all in vain, and they stained the bridle with their bloody foam. Hippolytus saw his whole chariot shattered into bits, and he fell at last entangled in the reins, dragged by the horses that his hand had fed. His voice had called them, merely frightened them. Onward they flew, his body now one whole wound. He opened, and then straightway in dying closed his eyes. Heaven takes my life, though innocent, he cried. When I am dead, protect Aricia, and tell my father to show that princess clemency, to give her back. And then he passed away. Now, the monster that arises from the waves here is literally the one sent by the sea god with its slimy folds. But figuratively, given the language of monsters in this play, it is clearly the embodiment, if you will, the reification of sinful sexual passion that has afflicted Phaedra, but also afflicted Hippolytus throughout the play. It arises and drives the horses as wild as passion drives Phaedra wild. Hippolytus dies after being torn along the ground by the stampeding horses. He dies courageously, trying to protect his father from the knowledge of Phaedra's perversity, and at the same time, his dying words try to protect Aricia from his father's wrath. Indeed, his final words are that the listener employ Theseus to show Aricia clemency. At least he succeeds in that aim, because Theseus ends the play, indeed, telling Aricia that henceforth he will regard her as his daughter in the future. But does Hippolytus die a self-sacrificial death as a purely innocent victim, say the way Cassandra and Desdemona do? Well, if he is purely innocent and self-sacrificial, then he doesn't, according to Aristotle, qualify as a tragic hero. Because remember, for Aristotle, complete selfless virtue in the absence of some inner flaw isn't tragic. It seems grotesque. It seems it seems horrifyingly unjust. Well, Racine's claims in his preface that Hippolytus' desire for Aricia itself isn't virtuous, but rather sinful, and is therefore a tragic weakness, is something I suppose we would have to believe in if, from an Aristotelian point of view, we want to see him as a tragic figure, somehow doomed or punished for his sexual passion. But as I've noted, this is very difficult for most readers and most viewers of this play today to accept, and I suspect it was even true in Racine's own time. So if we are unable then to regard Hippolytus as conventionally tragic, in a certain sense, one might argue that Theseus is actually more suited to Aristotle's idea of tragic heroism than Hippolytus is. After all, he commits a clear hamartia, an error. Due to his jealousy and impatience, he condemns his son to death. And also, like an Aristotelian tragic hero, in a moment of recognition, he realizes and regrets that he has killed a son who may very well have been innocent, and feels tremendous regret. My son, fond hope, I have myself destroyed. Inexorable, all too helpful gods, what keen remorse will haunt me all my life? Okay, well, certainly both of these things conform to Aristotle's model. But I think at the same time, we must recognize that he is in some ways far from tragic, because after all, despite these vestiges of tragedy, he is, after all, not noble enough really to earn our sense of sympathetic pity and fear. He's dominated by his jealousy, by his irrational rage, and for that matter, by his libidinousness, and so it's not a matter of being in any way driven to a mistake by a single flaw. No, the only really convincing tragic figure in this play, that is a figure who is fundamentally noble, but makes a terrible and fatal mistake because of a weakness in her character, is of course Phaedra. The play ends with her confession of forbidden passion. And in making this confession, Phaedra clears Hippolytus's name and tries to clear her own conscience as she resolves to punish herself through an act of suicide. It was I, Theseus, who, on your virtuous filial son, made bold to cast a lewd, incestuous eye. Heaven in my heart lit an omened fire. Detestable Onanone did the rest. The wretch, exploiting my enfeebled state, rushed to denounce Hippolytus to you. She has exacted justice now on herself, and found beneath the waves too mild a death. She's drowned herself. I have instilled into my burning veins a poison that Medea brought to Greece. Already it has reached my heart and spread a strange chill through my body. Even now, only as through a cloud, I see the bright heaven and the husband whom I still defile. But death, robbing my eyes of light, will give back to the sun its tarnished purity. Well, this is moving in certain ways, but is it a sufficient confession? I think some, including me, are troubled by Phaedra's continued blame of Onanone for, quote, exploiting her enfeebled state. It's not that she's blaming the gods now. She accepts responsibility largely for her lust and for the lies, but she still places too much of responsibility on her maid, to the point that it sounds as if she is making an excuse, even as she says, I'm punishing myself for my unforgivable lust by poisoning myself. Now, having come to what seemed like a full moral recognition, self-recognition earlier, this seems like a kind of retreat into a certain dishonesty. I would suggest that Phaedra's failure to take on the burden of responsibility completely for her treatment of Hippolytus and his death is troubling, and for her betrayal of Theseus is troubling, but maybe more troubling than Racine intended, I would suspect. Phaedra concludes her speech by announcing that she has taken the poison that Medea brought to Greece and that she is going to die very soon. Why choose poison to end her life? 3 reasons, I think. First, because it will cause her the greatest suffering, which she feels she deserves. Second, because poison fits the crime in that her passion was itself a corrosive poison that seemed to run through her veins and possess her body. And finally, poison is appropriate because it is a poison that was created by Medea, and she chooses it, linking herself with Medea here, appropriately, because they are both women who were filled with a destructive passion for a man who rejected them. In Medea's case, Jason; in her case, Hippolytus. Phaedra seems to identify with Medea here in that respect, but she turns the destructive power of Medea's poison that Medea had used against others in a way that Medea doesn't against herself, taking her own life. Stop.